Wominjeka, welcome, in the language of the Kulin Nation whose traditional lands we are meeting upon today. My name's Richard Watts. I'm a writer and broadcaster, and before I introduce our speakers tonight and brief you a little bit more about the topic of what we'll be discussing, I wanted to acknowledge that, as I said, we are meeting on Kulin country. I would like to pay my respects to the First Peoples of this nation, their leaders past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Tonight, we're going to be exploring 100 years of Australian art with documentary filmmaker Kerry Gardner AM and internationally renowned artist Patricia Piccinini, and we're going to be talking about what is arguably the most important and most influential art event in the world, visual art event in the world, the Venice Biennale. So, to my right, Kerry Gardner AM is Chair of Australia at the Venice Biennale and a documentary filmmaker with a passion for art history and museum practice. She was the Deputy Chair of Heide Museum of Modern Art, a Director of the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia, works as a global champion for gender equality with the Global Fund for Women, was awarded an Order of Australia in 2018 for contributions to culture, the environment and the equality sectors, and is the author of this beautiful book, which will be on sale after our conversation. And to my left, Patricia Piccinini is a remarkable Australian artist whose work encompasses sculpture, photography, video and drawing. From her current exhibition, still showing at Flinders Street Station, A Miracle Constantly Repeated, which I urge you to visit if you've not done so already, to her Skywhale family, which recently graced Melbourne skies and had friends and colleagues of mine chasing the sky whales across Melbourne by bicycle, tracking and documenting their flight. Patricia's work questions the way that technology and culture change our understanding of what it means to be human. She blurs boundaries and blurs lines. And together, we'll be talking about the history of Australian representation at the Venice Biennale, why it's so significant. We'll hear from Patricia about her personal experience of showing there. But first, over to you, Kerry.
Thanks, Richard, and good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. I did this book and recognised the need for this book because when I was appointed in 2018 as chair of the Venice Biennale for Australia, I asked the Australia Council, the commissioning body, if I could read about the history of Australian artists in Venice. And they handed me a 16-page self-published tiny little booklet. And I thought, well, I don't think that's quite good enough. And I wanted to know a lot more, and I figured if I wanted to know a lot more, then a lot of other people would want to know more as well. And what I uncovered is, in fact, the history as we thought we knew it was very inaccurate. That's always exciting, whether you're making a film or writing a book or doing the work that any of you do. To discover something has been inaccurate and retold over and over again inaccurately is something that puts fire in your belly, and it certainly put fire in my belly, and I got to work mainly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which was a joy to work in their archive, which has been up until now in the basement of that beautiful building in the gallery, but is going to be elevated to the ground floor along with the major works at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for Sydney Modern. I urge any of you who work in research or just love art and art history to visit the new library at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and you can make an appointment to do that. That's the cover of the book, and I was telling Richard earlier, it could have been grey or brown if the publishers had their way. I was very determined that the cover was going to be pink because there is a feminist story in this book, and I love pink. We thought that the first Australian who represented our country was Sidney Nolan, along with Dobell and Drysdale in 1954, but we were wrong. The Biennale first opened in actually 1895. The first Australian exhibited in 1897. The first woman was not Rosalie Gascoigne in 1982. It was this woman in 1912, and that is a beautiful portrait of Thea Proctor, who was quite the wild woman of her day, living in London with a group of fairly radical Australian artists. She showed a work that we might look back on now and think was quite quaint and very feminine, and it was, but in its own way it was quite subversive. It was a painted fan, and Thea used to make the costumes for all the rabble-rousing Australian artists living in London and frequenting the balls at the Chelsea Arts Club, including Arthur Streeton. That just goes through some of the famous names that did exhibit before World War I, and you'll see that many of them went on to be household names: Conda, Lambert, Streeton, Thea Proctor, Tom Roberts. And as we know from the recent retrospective of Arthur Streeton's work last year at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, there's something about Venice artists, there's something about their longevity, about their ongoing and enduring fame and their place in Australian art history, as evidenced by Ms. Piccinini on my left, who exhibited in 2003, which was the year I met her, and has one of the most rock star international careers of any Australian artist ever. There's our timeline, and there's the quaint picture from 1912 of the fan. And if any of you ever go to, she has a number of works in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Thea Proctor, but there's also some beautiful fans from that series in the Queen's Club in Elizabeth Street in Sydney, if any of you have an opportunity to visit there. Disruptions in Venice over the years were usually caused by wars: First World War, Second World War, Vietnam War, but also the 1968 student demonstrations in Paris. It's a word from Juliana, who wrote the foreword for my book and was also the curator for the 2019 Venice Biennale for Australia with the artist Angelica Masiti. Australia at Venice, in our contemporary thinking, did start in 1954. It was the first national representation funded by the Australian government. Prior to that, artists had funded themselves and exhibited in the British Pavilion. We didn't have our own pavilion until 1988. Between 1954 and 1988, we exhibited all over Venice, sometimes as hosted by other nations, more often hosted by La Biennale itself in various locations. In 1988, we had our own temporary pavilion in the Giardini, or the gardens, as one of, I think, 39 national pavilions. And that stood until 2015, when it was replaced by a permanent structure designed by Denton Corker Marshall. And it's a very beautiful location on one of the canals in one of the prettiest parts of the Giardini in Venice. That's a roll call, really, of the artists since 1954. You've seen the artists prior to the First World War. 2003 was Patricia's year, and she'll tell you her story, but I know that that was the first time she'd ever been to the Venice Biennale as the national artist, and I think that's incredibly special. And I believe she hasn't missed a Venice since then, and in fact she's leaving next week to go back for the opening of the 2022 Venice Biennale, which should have been 2021 and was delayed by a year for reasons I don't need to go into. So this was the iconic work exhibited by Nolan, and he was also, in fact, our first commissioner. So the commissioner being the person who oversees the relationships between our country and La Biennale itself, which is a very old and quite conservative organisation, but there's nothing conservative about the art that's shown at the Biennale. I won't labour over these because we want to get into a great conversation with Patricia, but what you'll notice about these early works is, of course, sometimes the colour fields were quite radical and the subject matter was radical, but then we do strange things like going back to 1891 in 1958, and all work at the Venice Biennale is supposed to be nationally representing your country by a living artist. And Streeton had been dead for 15 years when this was exhibited, plus the work was 60 years old. And really not the right subject matter for the 1950s in Venice. And in fact, we were kind of laughed off the world stage with these kinds of works. And what resulted from that was that we didn't go back for 20 years. So there was a gap between 1958 and 1978 because we received such dreadful press sending that Streeton and Roberts show. And we were very gun shy. Up until 58, 54, 56 and 58, the Prime Minister, Menzies, was responsible for choosing the national artist. The poor art gallery directors in Sydney and Melbourne and other states as well desperately tried to get them to understand that we needed to be sending contemporary art that reflected a contemporary Australia. But we really got an F for that. And so we stayed away for 20 years. That's a rare photograph of the building of the 1988 Pavilion, which was assembled in Sydney and shipped over. Unfortunately, didn't quite make the grade on opening day, and the roof was open and Arthur Boyd's paintings started melting and only were up for a few hours, long enough to be reviewed by the press, and then they were moved to safer ground and the pavilion was finished but never reopened that year. This is, some of the wonderful ways in which Australians have used the pavilion. That's Sean Gladwell's work, seemingly our first Australian female in 1982, Rosalie, who came to her art career in older age, it had to be said, I think in her late 50s. Our first Indigenous showing with Rover Thomas and Trevor Nichols in the 1990, quite late, and our first with these really very iconic works. It's so typically Rover Thomas, Trevor Nichols with a very different eye, but to have these two men land in Venice, it must have been a wild ride for them. Neither of them had ever been outside Australia. This is the first Indigenous female exhibition in 1997, and I really enjoyed researching this part of the book because it was not only an all-female artist team, it was an all-female curator team. There's a beautiful picture of Emily, probably one of my favourite pictures in the book. That's part of her group show. Judy Watson, and then we come to the lovely Patricia. People were really blown away by this show, and I won't usurp Patricia's own story, but imagine walking into the Australian Pavilion in Venice, and was that in the pavilion, Patricia? Did you show?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
It was the pavilion. So artists don't have to show in our pavilion. That's the final year of the temporary pavilion, and the roof, we go right back to what it was like in the year before the roof was finished. So Simran Gill responded to that by not replacing the roof, and her show was ephemeral, and it disintegrated over the 7 or 8 months that the Biennale ran. But her work was very beautiful. That's a statement from the architects before their beautiful new pavilion was opened in 2015, which really took us to a new era. We were able to be far more sophisticated and ambitious in the way we dreamt about representing Australia, and artists had much more freedom from a technological point of view about what they could do, and a lot more freedom about how they could treat both the inside and the outside of the pavilion. Fiona Hall was the opening artist in the new pavilion, and she chose to paint the inside. It was a black shell with a white interior, and she chose to paint it black. Fiona was part of the launch event last year at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for the book, and spoke very deeply about how much it had affected her. And I'll nearly finish on this slide, because this is our latest artist, and he's just flown over to Venice, and he's there now installing his show and putting the finishing touches to his quite significant catalogue, which is having to be printed in just outside Venice, because at the moment shipping anything anywhere is just extraordinarily difficult. So we've really had to adjust our calendars for the artist and for the show to make sure that everything arrives on time and the artist is fully supported. That's the back cover of my book, and I couldn't have chosen a better shot than one of Patricia's iconic works from the year that she was there. And I'll now hand over to Richard and Patricia so you can learn more about her experience in Venice. Thank you.
So, Patricia, as we've heard, you were invited to represent Australia with your exhibition We Are Family at the 50th Venice Biennale in 2003. Tell us about the impact that had on you, both personally and professionally.
It had a huge impact on my career because I wasn't known outside of this country. I'd been in a few biennales, like the Berlin Biennale and the Gwangju Biennale and Havana, not Havana, but so I'd have been in a few international shows, but I wasn't really known. But when I had this exhibition, all of a sudden my work was on the cover of the art newspaper. When at the time of the Venice Biennale opening, it was in the New York Times, it was in the London Times, and in the Washington Post. So I had this moment of being present in the art world, from an artist that no one knew anything about. So in terms of my career, it meant that I was able to connect with some interesting people, one of them being a gallery in New York. It was the Robert Miller Gallery. It wasn't like the top tier, but it was a very respectable gallery. It was very good for me. It was a great good gallery for me to enter the international art world in. And yeah, it just meant that I could have more of an international presence, which is very hard for Australians to do. So this is one of the few occasions that Australians can have this opportunity to be on the world stage, to be amongst other artists of the same calibre, ilk, sensibility, I suppose, and have the same opportunities. Because being in Australia, we have wonderful artists, wonderful institutions, but it's really hard to for other people outside of Australia to see what we do. And this was my chance, yeah.
Now, while you're talking, I believe you've got some slides that you can show us of kind of your experience of Venice.
So this is pre-social media, So we didn't take many shots. These were just really, they're really terrible. I feel really, I'm sorry, they're really slightly lackluster, but at least you're going to have a sense of a little bit what it was like. So these were the crates. So just getting anything into Venice is really hard at any time because of the canals. So it was like when the crates arrived, it was like a big breath out. And it's very expensive. That was a big part of the budget. So I had to just take a picture there, just go, they're here. And this is my partner, Peter Hennessy, and he installed the show with an Australian team. And here he is. We're so happy opening up the boxes. I think that's the video player, projector. Here he is. We were so ecstatically, sort of jubilantly happy to just be working on it. And this is Peter making something. I don't know. And here we are installing it. So one of the fantastic things about the Australian Pavilion is that we always send over our own team and we install it ourselves, and we also sit the gallery, and those people have a fantastic opportunity to connect with other pavilions and other artists. And you'll see that, and here are some of them. So there's Mark Feary, who's now at Gertrude Street, and there's Louise Tegard, and she runs Ballarat Art Gallery. And there's Linda Michael, the curator, who's fabulous and amazing. She was already at the MCA. And then there's Kendra Morgan. So they all come, and they're really young. Look at how young we look. Here's Mark and Peter installing work. Here's Peter, he's always under works. These are all my pictures and here they all are, all of us just installing it. And they're all people in the art world now, which is just a great thing. And they stay there for like 8 months. Here's Linda. She was the most amazing curator. She did such a fantastic job. She came up with the title, We Are Family, and did all the essay. And she was the one. So what happens is every year, every Biennale is different. So the time that I was selected, they asked curators to put in proposals, and so she put in the proposal for me. And it's really great that she did, because the time before they'd asked artists to put in proposals, and I'd put one in and it was rejected. And I remember feeling, I haven't cried very often in my career, but I remember being on a ferry and just crying, and my father-in-law looking at me, and it's kind of, what's going on? It was a very emotional thing. So anyway, she put in the proposal, and it was accepted. And here we are. So every day we'd eat together because we worked really hard. And this is a shot of the opening. I was wondering if you were going to be in this shot, Kerry. I was looking for you. Oh no, you weren't there.
No,
that's right.
My first year was the following year.
One, yeah, you weren't there. And this is what the show looked like. So it was really hot that year, and people were dying in Venice, and literally it was like one of those heat waves, and my feet swelled to like this big. I remember walking home with like these big feet. But the Australian Pavilion had air conditioning, which is a lot because the English Pavilion didn't have it. And we did that because the Arthur Boyds melted. Yeah. So I was a recipient of this great wisdom, and this is what the show looked like. Thousands of people come through, tens of thousands during the first 3 days of the vernissage.
People may not realise the little girl sitting on the floor is an artwork.
Yeah.
It's not a little girl sitting on the floor.
I'll show. And this is me. And I have to tell you, in the 3 days of the vernissage, I did 80 interviews. 80. So I'd get up, breakfast interview, another interview in the piazza, and then run to the gallery, then have these interviews, 10 minutes interviews, TV, radio, newspaper, 80. And on the third day, I just went home and cried hysterically.
I don't blame you.
And I just thought it is my responsibility to talk to everyone. There's a lot of expectations when you're the artist. I felt a real kind of, I need to do the best by my country and take up every opportunity and talk about the work in any capacity I could. So I really worked hard. And this is one of the works. This is Game Boys Advanced. And it's about the idea of cloning and the idea of will we love the imperfections that come about through the use of technology, because they're not perfect. They're prematurely aged. So it was around the time of Dolly. Most people walk by this work. They just didn't even see it, which is, this was a video work that was projected on, which is about reproduction. It's very visceral. This was these helmets, which were about the idea of kind of these safety devices for people that were different, but they didn't need them because they were different. They needed them because they engaged in risky behaviour, which I thought was, for me, it's kind of a different way of looking at difference. Like they needed it because they drove really fast motorcycles. And also it's talking about detailing and customising. And this is the leather landscape. This work ended up in a collection in America. And interestingly, this little piece of this creature here, this chimera, she was cut out and she was stolen. Not literally, but the image of her was stolen. And this is quite a crazy story. I don't know if you know about it, but she was taken out of context, because this work is all about connection and not anthropomorphizing, saying like they're like us. It's about like we are like them, and it's all about connection and it was taken out of context and used to just bully a whole bunch of people into behaving. Otherwise, they might end up like her in the Muslim countries. Yeah. Anyway, I could go into it if you like later. So there she is. I thought she was beautiful. They thought she was abhorrent. This is the work that Kerry was talking about, and it's still up in stem cells, and it talks about when we create new life, what are the reasons that we might want to do that for, and what's our relationship to those creatures. And this is the sort of one of the major works. And so because the gallery was like a beach house, the idea was that we would turn it into a house and it would be inhabited by these personalities, these creatures. And that's the only way I could make that pavilion work, because it really wasn't very grand, was it? No. It was really it was a beach house. So it kind of worked to put these creatures in there. And this work is about the idea that at that time we were talking about growing human organs in other species, so that you would make a creature that had your own, a sort of changed genetic structure, like you would insert your genetic structure into genetic material in it, so when they grew an organ, you would be able to harvest it and not reject it because it was your own genetic material. And so at that time it wasn't science fiction, but it was a kind of science sort of dream. And my work is about the idea that, well, what's our responsibility to the creatures that we create, and what's our duty of care? And the backbone of this work is that, would you kill her children to save your own? That's the work. And she's a mother, and you can see she's sentient, and she's thinking about her children, and they're organ growers. And yeah, I just read that book, Never Let Me Go, and I thought, I want to do that. But anyway, and so interestingly, just last year, a human pig chimera was actually created to pass the embryonic stage. So, that's proof that we can do that. We can use this technology. So at the time, people were thinking, oh, it's science fiction, it's sort of crazy, it's like it's a doomsday scenario, and now it's something, the meaning of the work has really shifted. Like, the work's the same, but the way we look at it is really different.
Yeah. Let's keep that image up on the screen for a moment and step back for a moment. And Kerry, I might get you to move your microphone just a little bit closer to you, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Sure.
Perhaps a question for both of you. And Kerry, I'll start you off with this one. There are numerous visual arts events, biennales, triennales and so forth around the world, but why has Venice become such a signifier, such a cultural institution and powerhouse in comparison to, say, I don't know, Sao Paulo, Berlin, even the Biennale of Sydney, for example? What is it about Venice that has made it into the institution that it is?
You could ask 10 people that question and you'd get 10 different answers. But for me, there's something important about it not being a selling exhibition. Business is transacted, but it's transacted in bars at night. Not that kind of business. But art is, artists are discovered, works are bought, gallerists are incredibly active in Venice. But it's very different than something like the Melbourne Art Fair. It has an innate historical integrity that goes back to 1895. It has a very pure intent that's really never changed. And in one of the essays, I state what that intent is, and it's the same now as it was in 1895, which is, to sort of go boldly, to be singular in bravery, to not shy away from sacred cows. The religion and sex and the mixing of religion and sex in Italy has always been problematic. And very early on, the first or second Biennale, there was a scandal. There was an artwork that scandalised the church. But La Biennale as an institution stood firm and said, we have a purpose and it is to show contemporary art and we're not bowing down to anyone, including the Catholic Church, which was pretty gutsy in 1895. So it's had a kind of integrity. Doesn't mean there hasn't been shoddy things that have happened over the years. Of course there have. But it is the pinnacle. I think there's something innate about the Giardini itself with the national pavilions. I think that captures a very lofty idea that we have national representation. The Arsenale, which is a huge has been a munitions factory, has been a shipbuilding factory, on a scale you really can't imagine, is the other part of the Venice Biennale. So there's the national pavilions in the gardens, and then there's the shipwright area called the Arsenale, or the Arsenal. And artists all over the world are invited to participate in that by the curator of La Biennale. So Australia chooses our artist, La Biennale chooses all of the artists that go into the Arsenale. We don't have any control over that. It's on a big scale, it's in an incredibly beautiful city, and it's the oldest Biennale in the world.
Patricia, any thoughts to add to that?
I agree with everything you said. And plus, everyone goes there. Yeah.
Yeah, success breeds more success.
Yeah, if you're going to go to one Biennale, you'd probably go to that one.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, and you don't have to be an art expert to go.
Yeah.
All sorts of people go. And one of the things I kind of really get a kick out of is a lot of people dress really wildly to go to the Biennale. And so you see the most amazing costumes, people dressed really wildly and extravagantly. But it's a marathon. You get up in the morning, have your breakfast, you know, head off with your water bottle and your bag over your shoulder, and nobody wears anything in Venice except runners. And, you know, you go from dawn till dusk, and there's an energy. You meet a lot of people from all over the world standing in the coffee queue or the loo queue or whatever, and the whole city embraces Venice. That's the other thing. Every restaurant, every cafe, every hotel give themselves over to the Biennale, and the Venetians love the Biennale because it's high quality tourism.
Something that I had not necessarily thought of before until, Patricia, you were showing your slides. You showed us a collection of people who are now players in the Australian art world at a much earlier stage in their career. So, yes, Venice connects artists internationally, but would it be also fair to say that Venice connects Australian artists and Australian arts workers in kind of the same way?
Yes, totally, because we're there working together, and the invigilators are there for 8 months. So they get to know each other really well, and there's quite a lot of them, and it's and they come back with all this experience and a sense of the potential of art and how it can be, and they bring that back here.
When you say a sense of the potential of art, can you expand on that? What is that potential?
I guess, well, when Kerry said the Venetians love the Biennale, she's right. And I think that art possibly has operates in a different way, like there's more respect for it, I suppose. I think it's changing here, but I guess, I think, I don't know, it's just more revered or more just treasured or more cared about, and people are, welcome it more, I suppose. I think it is changing,
But what's not changing is the arts budget keeps being cut every year.
Yeah, that's true.
That's not happening in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of respect for art, it's something that certainly struck me, Kerry, with kind of your book itself. The fact that, as you acknowledged, popular wisdom, received wisdom, had us think that Australian representation at Venice didn't begin until 1954, that the first female artist wasn't showcased, the first female Australian artist wasn't showcased until 1982. As you've shown, as you've learned in writing and researching this book, kind of what we thought was not true. And I wondered, and again, this is perhaps a question for both of you, but why do you think Australia has done such a poor job previously in documenting the history of our artistic representation at Venice? Is it yet another sign that as a culture, as a nation, Australia doesn't value art and artists?
I think it's a publishing question too, because it's very expensive to produce a book like this, because you've got all the copyright permissions, you've got thousands of hours of research, and many publishers don't want to support that, you know, and it's a long, tedious, expensive process. But to me, it was absolutely essential that it was done, and I can tell you the art world are really grateful that it has been done. And in the back of the book, I've actually got an image of every work that has ever been exhibited since 1954, and it's the only place that they're all held together. This is the only publication where you can find that. And that took an enormous amount of research and cooperation. And, you know, there's, amongst the gallery directors now, there's a real push for images to be freely available for books like this, because it's just exorbitantly expensive to pay for images. And really, you shouldn't be paying for images that are in public collections, because the public have paid for them to be in those collections, right? You know, public funding, government funding have set up those institutions, and those images should be available to anybody who requests them, as long as it's for a reasonable purpose. So I think this is a very boring answer, in a way, that that it's actually technically and financially very difficult. It's not that people don't care, but, you know, in the course of writing this book, I've just met so many great curators and young people who said, oh, I worked in the Venice Pavilion when I was 21, or I went to Venice when I was 18, I decided I was going to be an artist or a curator. And so I do think it has lasting impact, and more where, you know, I think we have a responsibility. 85% of funding for this year's Biennale was raised through private funds, only 15% through government funds. And so even though it's only 15%, I believe that Venice shows should come back to Australia and tour. And Angelica Mercedes' show was actually purchased by the National Gallery of Australia. And I think your show toured in part, didn't it? And went into lots of private collections when it came back to Australia.
It went to the Bendigo Art Gallery.
Right, okay. Yeah. So, I mean...
they bought that work.
And they bought that work?
So she lives there.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's just been a lack of consistency, I'd say, you know, going through the book, and, you know, because you have a different curator and different artist and a different commissioner for every Biennale. What I'd love to see is more consistency, a kind of guidebook to... you know, what should happen to the works? You know, what's our sovereign responsibility to this line of artists through history? And, you know, one of the things I have instituted since I've been chair over the last 4 years is that I consider Patricia an alumna, of Venice Biennale artists, and I want them to all know one another, and that every living Venice artist should be invited to every event connected to Australia at the Venice Biennale, and I've started doing that, and the artists themselves enjoy it, and audiences really enjoy it.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that it is a very special experience, and yeah, it's hard to imagine what it's like unless you do it, especially coming from here, like the Giardini is like this. I don't know. It's like a Disneyland of art. It's huge, and it's amazing.
I love the idea of kind of a continuum of Australian art, and you being part of that kind of a history of representation. Do you feel that sometimes when you think about Venice, that you are one of artists, and artists have come before you and coming after?
Yes, and I also think that my work was chosen to kind of reflect what Australia was interested in at the time. And I think every artist is sort of like that as well. Like, so I think it's slightly political. Like, it's like, yeah, this is how we want to present ourselves. These are the ideas that this community and country is interested in. And this is the artist that we're choosing to represent us, to discuss those ideas, to bring them to the world. And I really did see that as my job. It was I felt an enormous amount of kind of responsibility to do the best possible show that I could. And in fact, in my career, it allowed me to actually have the funding, because there's a funding component to this, which I had never had before, to produce a whole body of new work that for me was a real step forward in my practice. So, yeah, it's a massive privilege, and one that I did not take. I didn't feel entitled, or I didn't take it for granted. I totally... it was all consuming, and I worked really hard on it. I mean, I know that sounds really, I don't know, nerdy, but it's the way it was.
But also, Patricia, if you don't mind me interjecting, Richard, I mean, it launched your career. You weren't just on the front page of the New York Times. You became a New York, based artist in some ways. But, I mean, I look at your career over even the last 10 years, and one of the reasons Patricia couldn't commit earlier to doing the night with me tonight is because she was going to Poland for the opening of her new show. And obviously, we all know why she's not in Poland now. But Patricia really, I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying, would be the most internationally shown artist, I think I'm right, that Australia has ever produced.
And and this show, like I had this show in Brazil. I had this show in Brazil that had 1.3 million people attend it, and it happened because they had a touring show of Picasso that dropped out, and the curator said, "Oh my God!" Oh no, the institution, which was this fantastic funding body called Banca Cultural de Brazil, they said, "Oh." They went to curator, "Do you have any ideas? Do you have any ideas?" And he said, I think I remember an artist in 2003, the Biennale of Venezia. And he rang me up.
Great.
And he said, and this was Marcello Dantas, he said, "Patricia, you don't know me, but I saw your work 15 years ago. Can we do a show?" And I said, "Yes." We can do that. And we just pulled it together, and it went to São Paulo, Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte. It was like, and it was because of that show. And still, I still get exhibitions from that show, still. And perhaps it's because I'm an Australian and I haven't really had it. Like if I was in London, perhaps it'd be very different. And I'd be in these international shows all the time because that's their milieu, that's their culture, that's their city, that's their place, Whereas Australia, very active here, and we do great things here, but it sort of stays here. Yeah.
Which again reinforces the importance of Venice on the world stage in the art world, and also kind of the remarkable kind of power of your work as well. Let's open it up to questions from the floor. I'm sure there's a couple of people out there, hopefully not literally dying to ask a question or two, but we've got a couple of roaming mics, I believe. So if anybody does have a question, please raise your hand so one of the ushers can see you and bring a microphone to you. And could we maybe raise the house lights a little bit so we can see people as they talk as well, please? Or perhaps everybody is just in awed and stunned silence.
Can I ask, who's been to the Venice Biennale? Oh, at least half the audience, I'd say. And who's going this year? 1, 2, 3, 4. Great.
Next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a difficult time. And I was saying to Richard earlier that in 2019 we took 160 patrons, majority in Vernissage Week, opening week, which this year is April the 20th. It was May in 2019. We took about 120 in May and about 40 in September. And that's another thing that's unique to Australia, that we take patrons' trips and anybody can go on those trips. And it's quite a modest investment in supporting the artist. And it started actually around the time that Patricia was the national artist. And it's grown and grown from being primarily government funded to being primarily privately funded, which, you know, I have some philosophical issues with. But anybody who is interested, if you look at the Australia Council website, I won't be in the role in 2024, but we will be running those trips again, probably once or twice to Venice for anyone who is interested.
And we do have a question.
Thanks so much for your presentations. I'm so thrilled and in awe that you are both here tonight. I was just wondering about, particularly given Australia's history in the Biennale and on the world stage, why Australia has its own pavilion in the Giardini?
It's a great question. It was the vision of one man who was an Italian called Franco Belgiorno Nettis, and his family established Transfield in Sydney, who were responsible for infrastructure building, is now a third generation of that family. But Franco funded the lease of the land in the Giardini and eventually the purchase of the land from the city of Venice. And he was the one who manufactured and shipped over the first temporary pavilion. So it was actually one man's vision, Franco Belgiorno Nettis.
We're officially out of time. What I would recommend, if you have questions, Kerry will be at the back of the room shortly, where copies of the book will be available for sale. So perhaps some time to ask an individual question rather than one in front of everybody. And let's face it, a casual conversation is sometimes less daunting than asking a question of people on stage or vice versa. So please thank Kerry Gardner and Patricia Piccinini. And please go and buy a copy of, as I said, this beautifully produced book.
Thanks, Richard.